Hi, I'm Adrian van Breda. I'm a professor of social work at the University of Johannesburg and an Anglican priest, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about religion, spirituality, and social work in South Africa. This first slide shows the degree of religiosity around the world, and I've marked with arrows Germany and South Africa, and you'll see that the orange colors there are very similar. South Africa just only slightly more religious than Germany, and I would have thought that that difference would be much greater, and maybe that's something we need to interrogate when we meet. Here what we see is the most prominent religions in each country around the world, and the thing I want you to notice is how blue it is. Blue represents Christianity, and this is most likely a result of colonization by England, by Holland, France, Spain, and Portugal. They pretty much colonized most of the world. The main places where it's not Christian is in North Africa and the Middle East, as Islam, and then Buddhism and Hinduism in parts of Asia. This is a study on religion in South Africa that you can get off Wikipedia, and 11% of South Africans report no religious affiliation at all. It's a small percentage, 1 in 10. And so most South Africans, 78%, report having some religious affiliation. 3/4 of South Africans, maybe just a little more than 3/4, in fact, is again all the kind of blue, report a Christian affiliation. And the most prominent of those is African independent churches. And then in the section with the green and the red and yellow and orange and so on, these are other smaller religions. So I want you to notice there that Islam, for example, makes up less than 2% of the South African population. Hinduism just 1% and Judaism 0.1%. Very small numbers of people from religions outside of Christianity. Interestingly, in 2022, other data was collected that found that 85% of South Africans profess to be a Christian. On the previous slide, it looked like about 3/4, maybe a little over 3/4. And so perhaps there's been a rise in Christian affiliation over the last several years. So let's go back a little bit in time and think about the history of religion in South Africa. So in pre-colonial times, before people from the global north, from England and Holland, came to South Africa, people have been practicing traditional African religions for as long as we can remember and as long as we have any information on this. So people have been practicing traditional religions within their local communities in Africa and in South Africa long before Europeans came. But then Europeans began traveling around Africa from Europe all the way down to Cape Town, South Africa, and then back up towards India and Asia. And the first people to do so were the Portuguese, and they primarily just planted crosses along the coastline of Africa. Cape of Good Hope then became established as a trading station, but also as a refreshment point for those people traveling from Europe to India. It was a very long journey, and they could stop in Cape Town and the Cape of Good Hope and replenish their supplies and rest. And so this became quite a large colony of people, mainly from Holland. And so the Dutch were the people who settled here first in 1652. From the Dutch East India Company, and they created large settlements of Dutch people who are now mostly the Afrikaans-speaking people in South Africa. About 20 years later, the French Huguenots arrived. These were French Protestants who were fleeing the persecution of the French Catholics, which was the majority religion in France. They all migrated north towards Holland and then came to South Africa with the Dutch. About 100 years later, the British arrived, bringing again with them Christianity, Anglican religion, Methodist religions particularly. And over that period, from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, the British settled here. And so all of these cultures and colonizers from Europe were bringing Christianity with them, and so large numbers of local peoples converted to Christianity. But they were not the only ones, and although, as we've seen, Christianity is a dominant religion in South Africa, others are here as well. Islam came to South Africa between the mid-1650s to 1750s with the Cape Malay people, who were slaves brought here from Malaysia and Indonesia by the Dutch settlers to work, and they continue to primarily live in the Western Cape area. Hinduism came into the country through the bringing in of indentured laborers from India who worked on the sugar plantations in KwaZulu-Natal. Buddhism came with the migrant of Indians and Chinese people, and Judaism arrived in smaller numbers from the early 1800s when the British were coming here. So let's think then, Lars, sort of as we move towards the end here, a bit about religion and social work in South Africa and how these two have connected. So Christian missionaries came with all of these waves of colonization from Europe, and they were here primarily to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in the process of doing that, they did what many missionaries did, just to build and to run schools and hospitals and other kinds of social outreach and welfare work to try and uplift and develop the local communities. And so this is where Christianity became really quite embedded in South African society. But we must remember that these missionaries were also bringing with them Western and particularly British values and culture. And so they became instruments of colonization and of the promulgation of the British Empire and its values. William Wilberforce, who was a very well-known anti-slavery advocate, said that Christianity teaches the poor to be diligent, humble, patient, and obedient, and to accept their lowly position in life, making inequalities between them and the rich appear to be less galling. And this, in a sense, confirms Marx's idea about the opium of Christianity being the opium of the people, is that Christianity kind of teaches indigenous peoples to be subordinate and just to kind of accept the dominance of white people. Not a good thing. So when we look at this relationship between religion and social work in South Africa, what we find is that early social work was quite deeply rooted then in Christian racism. In the 1800s, the Dutch Reformed Church was very large, prominent, and dominant in South Africa, and they were advocating a kind of white nationalism rooted in the Bible. And by the end of the 1800s, there was a massive problem around poor white Afrikaans-speaking people that resulted in particular from the Anglo-Boer War, where women and children were interred in concentration camps, and many of them died in their thousands. So by the early 1900s in South Africa, there was massive white poverty around the country. And organizations like the Afrikaanse Christelike Vrouwenvereniging, ACVV, Afrikaans Christian Women's Association, got established during this time, along with many other Christian welfare organizations, and the beginnings of social work began to be formalized. In 1932, the Carnegie Commission of Inquiry released its report on the poor white problem and began to address how, through institutional welfare for white people only, the issue of white poverty could be addressed. In that same year, 1932, the first degree course in social work was established at the University of Stellenbosch, and the year after, Hendrik Verwoerd was appointed as the first chair of social work at Stellenbosch. Now, we know Hendrik Verwoerd as the architect of apartheid, and this is how we see this very close relationship between Christianity, social work, and racism. So social work has historical roots in racism and white nationalism, and a lot of this came through the Dutch Reformed Church, mixed together with an ideology of white supremacy, an argument from the scriptures to say that black people were the descendants of Ham, which was one of Noah's sons, and in Genesis 9:25, the Bible says that the lowest of the slaves will he be to his brothers. And so Ham was seen as being marked on his skin, and so dark skin was seen as being a sign of Ham, and Ham was a servant of everybody else. It aligns very closely then with the 1948 slogan of the National Party, who of course won and established the apartheid government in that year, that the white man must remain master. And so today in social work in South Africa, religion is almost invisible in social work education, perhaps because of these roots. And so religion remains peripheral in most social work programs in South Africa. And even spirituality is quite peripheral, even though it seems a bit more benign. And it's kind of interesting that this happens because, in my experience, the majority, or certainly many students who come into social work are motivated by religion and faith. So I thought I'd just finish off on a little personal sort of story about my own experience when I studied. So I studied social work in the late 1980s, and at my university there was absolutely no place for religion. There was no mention that I can recall of spirituality, and in fact we were actively discouraged and prohibited from mentioning anything to do with religion in our work with clients. And so we kind of lived in this weird two-world sort of space where there was the world of social work on the one hand that we were all studying, and then on the other hand there was the world of religion and spirituality, which many of us were part of, and they were just completely separate and disconnected. It was only really decades later that I began to recognize the importance of spirituality and religion for human life and well-being through my work on resilience. And I began to think about how do I pull these two worlds together in myself and try and create a more integrated approach. And of course, part of that, a really important part of that, is how to avoid religious judgmentalism and dogmatism. And so this has been a journey for me that I'm hoping that we're going to be able to share together a little bit during this seminar. So that's it from me. Cheers. We'll see you in class. Bye-bye.